On a chilly November day in 1095, in the town of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II stood before a restless crowd. His words would ignite a flame that would burn for nearly 2 centuries. Deus vult! God wills it! Echoed through the crowd. And with that cry began one of the most dramatic, bloody, and transformative series of wars in human history, the Crusades. The Crusades were not a single war, but a chain of conflicts that stretched from the end of the 11th century into the late 13th. At their heart lay the city of Jerusalem, a place sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. For centuries, Muslims had controlled the Holy Land, allowing pilgrims of other faiths to visit. But by the late 11th century, the rise of the Seljuk Turks, a powerful Muslim dynasty, brought new tensions. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty, now weakened, appealed to the Pope for aid against the Turks. The call for help became something greater, a call to liberate Jerusalem itself. When Urban II preached his sermon, he promised salvation for those who took up the cross. Warriors who fought would not only earn eternal forgiveness but also glory and wealth. For poor knights and peasants across Europe, this was irresistible. Thousands sewed crosses onto their tunics and set out for the east. This was the first crusade. The march was brutal. Crusaders traveled thousands of miles facing starvation, disease, and constant attacks. Yet against all odds, they triumphed. In 1099, they stormed Jerusalem in a bloody siege. For the first time in centuries, the city was in Christian hands. But their victory was soaked in blood. Tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were massacred, their cries echoing through the streets of the holy city. The First Crusade created crusader states, small Christian kingdoms carved out of the Middle East. But these kingdoms were fragile, surrounded by hostile powers. Over the next decades, Muslim leaders began to rally. The greatest of them was Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. A man of intelligence, piety, and relentless determination, Saladin united the Muslim world. In 1187, he delivered a crushing blow to the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin. His victory led to the recapture of Jerusalem. Though unlike the Crusaders before him, Saladin spared the city from massacre. His name became legendary, feared by his enemies but also respected even by his foes for his chivalry and mercy. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Europe. It inspired the Third Crusade, led by kings rather than knights. Among them was Richard the Lionheart of England, a warrior king whose bravery matched his fierce temper. Richard and Saladin became locked in a duel of minds and swords, their armies clashing across the Holy Land. Though Richard never retook Jerusalem, his campaigns restored the Crusaders' pride and ended with a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage. The rivalry between Richard and Saladin became one of the most famous episodes in medieval history. But the Crusades did not stop there. Over time, their purpose shifted. Later Crusades became tangled in politics and greed. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Crusaders did not even reach Jerusalem. Instead, they sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the East. Churches were looted, relics stolen, and the Byzantine Empire weakened beyond repair. The Crusades, meant to unite Christendom, had begun to tear it apart. For nearly 2 centuries, Crusaders launched campaign after campaign, but their strength faded. Muslim dynasties grew stronger, while Europe turned its attention to other conflicts. By 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last Crusader stronghold, the age of the Crusades came to an end. Yet their impact was enormous. They reshaped the medieval world in ways few could have predicted. For Europe, the Crusades opened the gates to the East. Returning Crusaders brought back not only riches but also knowledge, new ideas in science, medicine, philosophy, and trade. The spices, silk, and technologies they encountered in the Middle East transformed European life and helped pave the way for the Renaissance. For the Muslim world, the Crusades were a test of unity and resilience. Leaders like Saladin became symbols of resistance and honor, remembered long after the battles ended. The wars also deepened mistrust between Christians and Muslims, a shadow that lingers even today. The Crusades also left scars on relations between Christian groups themselves. The sack of Constantinople poisoned the relationship between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, a wound that has never fully healed. Above all, the Crusades showed the power of faith to inspire both greatness and cruelty. They were wars fought not only for land but for belief, where kings and peasants alike shed blood for visions of salvation. They created heroes and villains, legends and tragedies. When we look back on the Crusades, we see a mirror of humanity itself, our hunger for glory, our capacity for violence, our ability to unite for a cause, and our weakness for greed. They were holy wars, yes, but they were also deeply human wars shaped by ambition, hope, and desperation. From the call of Pope Urban II to the fall of Acre, the Crusades remain one of history's most dramatic sagas. They were not merely battles for Jerusalem. They were battles that reshaped the medieval world, whose echoes still reach us today. In the late 11th century, Europe was restless. Kingdoms fought among themselves, peasants suffered under famine and poverty, and knights hungry for glory spilled blood across their own lands. It was a world of chaos, but also a world waiting for a cause, a banner that could unite them. That cause arrived in the year 1095. When Pope Urban II spoke words that would echo through history and change the medieval world forever. The spark came from the East. The Byzantine Empire, once the mighty heir of Rome, was crumbling under pressure. The Seljuk Turks, fierce Muslim warriors, had seized much of Anatolia and threatened the very heart of Constantinople. Emperor Alexios IV, desperate for aid, sent a plea to the Pope. What he sought was mercenaries, soldiers to help him defend his shrinking empire. What he received instead was something far greater, a holy war. In November of that year, Pope Urban II gathered a vast crowd at the Council of Clermont in France. Standing before nobles, knights, and peasants alike, he raised his voice in a fiery sermon. He spoke of Christian brothers in the East suffering under Muslim rule, of holy places defiled, of pilgrims beaten and turned away from Jerusalem. He painted the struggle as not just a war for land, but as a war for the very soul of Christendom. Then he offered something no warrior could ignore: salvation. Those who took up arms, he declared, would be forgiven of their sins. Eternal paradise awaited those who fought and died under the cross. It was an irresistible promise. The crowd erupted with cries of Deus vult, God wills it. The Crusades had been born. What followed was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Nobles sold their estates, peasants abandoned their fields, entire families set out on the long road east. The symbol of their vow was stitched onto their tunics, a red cross, marking them as soldiers of God. They became known simply as Crusaders, the bearers of the cross. Yet the crusade was not only about faith. For many knights, it was also about fortune. Lands in Europe were crowded, opportunities for younger sons were scarce, and the East promised wealth and power. For merchants, it was an opening for trade. For the Pope, it was a chance to unite a divided Christendom under his authority. Faith, ambition, greed, and desperation all mixed together in a storm that would soon sweep across the Middle East. The journey itself was brutal. Thousands set out, many untrained and ill-prepared. Some died of hunger, others of disease. The so-called People's Crusade, made up mostly of peasants, never even reached the Holy Land, cut down by Turkish forces long before. But the main armies, led by seasoned knights and noble lords, pressed on. For the men and women who marched, it was more than a military campaign. It was a pilgrimage of blood and fire. Each step toward Jerusalem was fueled by a sense of divine mission. Each hardship endured with the belief that they were fighting for God's will. The power of Pope Urban's words carried them forward, binding together kings and commoners, warriors and beggars, in a shared vision. The First Crusade was not a single army, but a collection of forces from across Europe. French lords, Norman knights, German warriors, all converging on the East. Despite their rivalries, the banner of the cross united them. For the first time, Christendom moved as one. By the time they reached the walls of Jerusalem in 1099, tens of thousands had already died. But those who remained believed themselves chosen. When the city finally fell, their victory was written in blood. The massacre that followed shocked even their contemporaries, but for the Crusaders it was the fulfillment of Pope Urban's call. Jerusalem was theirs, and with it, the belief that God's hand had guided their swords. The call of the cross had achieved what no king or emperor could. It had bound a divided Europe into a single, unstoppable force. Pope Urban II's sermon at Clermont was not just a speech. It was the spark that set the medieval world ablaze. The First Crusade had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. The summer sun of 1099 blazed mercilessly upon weary crusaders. They had marched for years across mountains, deserts, and battlefields, carrying their faith and swords toward a single destination, Jerusalem. Now, at last, the holy city stood before them, its golden walls gleaming in the distance. For the Crusaders, this was the culmination of Pope Urban II's call, the promise of salvation, the prize of unimaginable glory. But between them and that prize lay a fortress unlike any other. Jerusalem was defended by the Fatimid Egyptians, hardened warriors who knew the Crusaders would come. Its walls rose high, reinforced with towers, gates, and moats. Supplies within the city were plentiful, while the Crusaders stood outside, starving, battered, and weak. After years of marching, their numbers had dwindled. Many had died of disease or hunger, others had deserted, but those who remained believed themselves chosen by God. They were determined to seize Jerusalem at any cost. At first, the siege looked hopeless. The Crusaders lacked the tools to breach the mighty walls. They were starving under the desert sun, drinking brackish water and surviving on scraps. Morale plummeted, yet faith carried them forward. Priests led processions around the camp, barefoot, chanting prayers, carrying holy relics to inspire the weary. Some claimed to have visions of saints guiding them, urging them onward. Whether miracle or desperation, their spirits reignited. Then came the turning point. From Genoa and other Italian ports, Christian ships delivered wood, iron, and supplies. With these, the Crusaders built massive siege towers and battering rams. Day and night, hammers rang as they prepared engines of war. To their enemies on the walls, it must have seemed as though the Crusaders had conjured an army of giants from dust. On July 14, 1099, the final assault began. The Crusaders pushed their siege towers forward, arrows raining down from defenders above. Firepots crashed onto the towers and boiling oil scalded men alive, but still the Crusaders pressed on. The air was thick with smoke, blood, and the screams of the dying. At one section of the wall, led by Godfrey of Bouillon, a tower finally reached its mark. Ladders slammed against the walls and knights surged upward, shields raised, swords drawn. What followed was chaos. Fighting raged hand to hand atop the battlements, steel clashing against steel, men grappling and throwing one another from the walls. By sheer determination, the Crusaders broke through and the gates of Jerusalem were forced open. Then came the fury. The Crusaders poured into the city and Jerusalem became a sea of fire and blood. Christian chroniclers, writing with awe and horror, claimed that blood ran in the streets as knights slaughtered soldiers, civilians, and anyone they saw as enemies of Christ. Mosques were stormed, synagogues burned, and for days the city shook under the weight of violence. To the Crusaders, it was divine justice, a cleansing of the holy city. To their enemies, it was a massacre beyond imagination. Yet amidst the bloodshed, there was also triumph. Crusaders who had suffered for years fell to their knees, tears streaming as they entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the very site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Priests sang hymns, warriors wept, and all believed they had fulfilled God's will. The First Crusade had achieved its ultimate goal. Jerusalem was in Christian hands. The aftermath was monumental. A Christian kingdom was established in the heart of the Middle East, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. European lords took titles and lands, fortresses rose across the region, and for a time the Crusaders believed they had secured their dream. Word spread across Europe, and Pope Urban's call seemed vindicated. The impossible had been achieved, but victory carried a heavy cost. The bloodshed left deep scars, forging hatred that would echo for centuries. To the Muslim world, the fall of Jerusalem was a catastrophe, a call to arms that would one day bring forth champions like Saladin. To the Crusaders, it was the greatest victory of their lives, proof that God was on their side. In July 1099, Jerusalem was not just captured, it was baptized in fire and blood. The Crusaders believed they had won eternal salvation, but in reality, they had also unleashed a cycle of vengeance that would shape the destiny of East and West for generations to come. By the year 1187, the Crusader states in the Holy Land stood like fragile castles in the sand, their foundations weak, their rivalries deep. They had ruled Jerusalem for nearly a century, but a new force was rising from the Muslim world. A man whose name would strike both fear and respect across continents, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin. Saladin was not just a warrior, he was a statesman, a visionary, and above all, a unifier. Where Muslim lands had long been divided, torn by rival rulers and petty conflicts, Saladin brought them together under his banner. Patient, diplomatic, but utterly determined, he built a coalition stretching from Egypt to Syria. His ultimate goal was clear: to reclaim Jerusalem, the sacred city that had fallen to the Crusaders in 1099. The spark came when reckless Crusader lords, led by the fiery Reynold of Chatillon, broke truces and attacked Muslim caravans, even threatening Mecca itself. To Saladin, this was more than insult, it was blasphemy, and it gave him the cause to strike. He gathered his armies, tens of thousands strong, seasoned cavalry, and warriors who burned with religious devotion. His moment had come. The decisive confrontation unfolded near the horns of Hattin, twin hills rising above the arid plains of Galilee. The Crusader king, Guy of Lusignan, marched his knights and infantry out to meet Saladin, but it was a disastrous decision. The summer heat was merciless, and Saladin had prepared the battlefield with cunning precision. His forces controlled the wells and water sources, leaving the Crusaders parched and desperate. As the Crusader army struggled across the dry land, Saladin's cavalry harassed them with waves of arrows, striking swiftly and retreating before counterattacks. The heat, the thirst, the endless rain of arrows, it all wore down the once mighty knights. Campfires were set alight by Saladin's men, choking the Crusaders in smoke, making their suffering unbearable. By the time the two armies clashed directly on July 4th, 1187, the Crusaders were broken in body and spirit. Their formations collapsed, knights fell from exhaustion, horses collapsed in the dust. Saladin's army encircled them, closing like a tightening noose. The Red Cross banners that had once charged with such power now lay trampled in the dirt. At the height of the battle, the true cross itself, the most sacred relic of the Crusaders, believed to be the very wood upon which Christ was crucified, was captured by Saladin's forces. It was a crushing blow, a symbol that God had turned his favor away from the Crusaders. By evening, the Crusader army lay shattered. Thousands were slain, thousands more taken prisoner. King Guy himself was captured along with many of his nobles. Only Reynold of Chatillon, Saladin's sworn enemy, met a different fate. Brought before Saladin, he was offered mercy if he would repent for his treachery. Reynold refused, and with a single stroke of his own sword, Saladin executed him. To his followers, it was justice. To his enemies, it was a warning. The Battle of Hattin was not just a victory, it was the turning of the tide. With the Crusader army destroyed, their fortresses lay open to Saladin's advance. One by one, cities and castles surrendered. By the autumn of 1187, the unthinkable had happened. Jerusalem itself fell back into Muslim hands, not through a massacre, but through negotiation. Unlike the bloodbath of 1099, Saladin allowed the Christian inhabitants to leave safely if they could pay ransom. His chivalry and mercy shocked even his enemies, earning him respect as both a conqueror and a man of honor. The news of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem spread like wildfire across Europe. Shock, outrage, and grief shook Christendom. Kings and emperors swore new vows of vengeance, and soon the Third Crusade would rise, led by none other than Richard the Lionheart. But in that moment, in the burning summer of 1187, it was Saladin who stood as the master of the Holy Land, the man who had humbled the Crusaders and changed the course of history. The horns of Hattin had echoed with fire, steel, and the cries of the dying. From that battlefield, a new legend was born, the legend of Saladin, the warrior who turned the tide. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 shook Europe like thunder. The news raced through kingdoms, igniting fury and grief. Kings and nobles trembled at the thought that the holiest city of Christendom had been lost. In response, the greatest leaders of the West took the cross and vowed vengeance. Among them rose a warrior who would become a legend, remembered in ballads, stories, and chronicles. The King of England, Richard I, the Lionheart. His destiny was to meet Saladin, the unifier of Islam, in a clash that history would forever call the Duel of Titans. Richard was no ordinary king. He was a warrior king, born for battle, fearless in the charge and brilliant in strategy. Tall, commanding, with a sword always in hand, he embodied the knightly spirit of the Crusades. When he sailed for the Holy Land in 1190, he carried not only his armies but also the hopes of Christendom. Alongside him marched kings like Philip II of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, though their unity was fragile. Ultimately, it was Richard who stood as the true champion of the crusade. Saladin, by contrast, was calm and deliberate, less a fiery knight than a wise commander. He was admired not just by Muslims, but also by many Christians for his honor and chivalry. To him, Richard was both a dangerous enemy and a worthy rival. Both men understood that their struggle was not merely for land, it was for the soul of the Holy Land itself. The stage for their confrontation was set along the coastal plains of the Levant. Richard's most brilliant victory came at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, where his disciplined formations and devastating charges of knights smashed through Saladin's forces. Unlike the panicked defeat at Hattin, the Crusader army under Richard held its ground, proving that the Crusaders were not yet broken. At Arsuf, the Lionheart earned his name, and Saladin recognized that this opponent was unlike any he had faced before. Yet despite Richard's victories in battle, the war became a test of endurance rather than conquest. Richard was relentless, capturing cities along the coast, fortifying strongholds, and striking deep into enemy lands. But Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, remained beyond his grasp. Each time his army approached, doubts gnawed at him. Could he hold the city if he took it? Would his exhausted men endure a siege? Saladin, ever watchful, denied him opportunities, fortifying defenses and harassing supply lines. Between the clashes of swords, there was also respect. Chroniclers tell of moments of mutual admiration. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him gifts of fruit, snow to cool his fever, and even a horse when his own was killed in battle. It was a rivalry forged in fire but tempered with honor. To their followers, they were enemies. To each other, they were warriors bound by the same code of chivalry. The stalemate continued for years. Richard's victories restored Christian control over much of the coast, but his ultimate goal, Jerusalem, eluded him. Political pressures back in Europe demanded his return, and his resources dwindled with every passing season. Saladin, though weary and stretched thin, refused to yield the holy city. Both men, in their own way, were trapped by destiny. In 1192, after endless campaigning, the two leaders agreed to a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa secured safe passage for Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem, though the city itself remained under Muslim control. Neither Richard nor Saladin had achieved total victory, yet both had preserved their honor. When Richard sailed back to Europe, he left behind a reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his age. Saladin, though tested to the limits, had achieved his ultimate goal. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The clash between Richard and Saladin had ended not in destruction, but in mutual recognition of strength and dignity. Their rivalry became legend. Richard, the Lionheart, symbolized the valor and fire of the Crusades. Saladin, the noble sultan, embodied mercy and wisdom. Together, they represented the dual faces of medieval war, brutal and bloody, yet bound by an ideal of honor. In the chronicles of history, their duel was not just about victory or defeat. It was about two giants meeting on the stage of destiny. their swords clashing under the burning sun of the Holy Land, leaving behind a story that would echo for centuries, the clash of legends. By the late 13th century, the dream of the Crusader kingdoms was crumbling. For nearly 200 years, knights and kings had crossed the seas to carve out Christian states in the Holy Land. They had won glory at Jerusalem, clashed with Saladin, and built castles that rose like stone giants above the Levant. But time was no longer on their side. The tides of history had shifted, and the once mighty Crusader states were now little more than fragile outposts, clinging desperately to survival. Their final chapter would be written in blood at the city of Acre. Acre was the jewel of the Crusader kingdom, the beating heart of their power after the loss of Jerusalem. Bustling with merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims, its harbors were filled with ships from Italy, France, and beyond. Behind its mighty walls, it seemed invincible. But appearances were deceiving. The Crusader lords squabbled endlessly among themselves, divided by rivalries, greed, and ambition. Unity, the force that had once carried them to victory, was gone. Meanwhile, a new power had risen in the east, the Mamluks of Egypt. Fierce warriors, once slaves turned rulers, the Mamluks were disciplined, relentless, and utterly devoted to driving the Crusaders from the Holy Land. Under the command of Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, they prepared to strike the final blow. To them, Acre was not just a city, it was the last thorn of foreign invaders, a symbol that had to be torn out. In April 1291, the Mamluk army appeared before Acre, tens of thousands strong. With siege engines, catapults, and towers, they surrounded the city like a tightening fist. Inside, the Crusaders prepared for their last stand. Knights of the Temple, the Hospital, and the Teutonic Order donned their armor, ready to defend the walls with the fury of men who knew they faced the end. For weeks, the siege thundered on. Stones hurled by catapults crashed into towers, battering the defenses. Archers filled the skies with arrows, while the defenders rained fire and bolts upon the attackers below. The sound of steel and the cries of the wounded echoed day and night. The harbor remained open, and reinforcements trickled in from Europe. But they were too few, too late. The Mamluks were relentless. By May, the walls of Acre trembled under the constant bombardment. The defenders fought with unmatched courage, Templars leading desperate charges, Hospitallers holding their ground in blood-soaked streets. But the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. The final assault came on May 18th. Siege towers loomed over the walls, ladders slammed against the battlements, and wave after wave of Mamluk warriors poured into the city. The battle turned into a nightmare. Street by street, house by house, the Crusaders were driven back. Fires engulfed buildings, smoke and screams choking the air. Knights fought with the desperation of doomed men, but their cause was lost. Women, children, and civilians crowded the harbor, scrambling onto ships as chaos consumed the city. Many drowned in the panic, others were cut down before they could escape. The fall of Acre was brutal. Thousands were slain, and the great military orders suffered devastating losses. The Templars retreated to their fortress by the sea, holding out until the walls collapsed around them. Their last brothers fought to the death, refusing surrender. By the end, Acre was in flames, its churches desecrated, its walls torn down. The Crusader dream had burned away into ashes. With the loss of Acre, the Crusader states ceased to exist. The last remnants fled to the island of Cyprus, where they would survive only as shadows of their former power. Never again would a Crusader kingdom rise in the Holy Land. For Europe, it was the end of an era. For the Muslim world, it was a final victory, the cleansing of foreign invaders from their lands. Yet the memory of Acre did not die. To Europeans, it became a tale of heroism and tragedy, the final stand of warriors who fought to the last. To the Muslim world, it was proof of divine justice, a triumph that avenged centuries of suffering. To historians, it marked the closing of a chapter that had reshaped the medieval world. The Crusades had begun with the cry of Deus vult, God wills it. At Clermont in 1095, they ended with the fall of Acre in fire, blood, and silence. The cross had been driven from the Holy Land, and with it, the age of Crusader kingdoms came to an end.